Hi, I'm Jennifer. Welcome to Weave. I'm here on the traditional territories of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation, the T'an Council in Yukon, Canada. And I'm so thrilled to introduce this next guest of mine, Pádraig Ó'Tuama. He's the author of 4 books, including books of poetry. He is a poet, theologian, incredible conflict resolution specialist, and speaker of the heart. And I was so excited to have Pádraig on Weave because I've been following his work for a while. And what I love about his work and who he is his incredible gift of astute observation and exploring language and the power of language to create new communities and experiences of belonging, even in the most difficult, painful, and exclusionary experiences in our lifetimes. And so for me, as a leader and also a citizen of the world, I feel his work invites us into some really powerful reflections about how we wield our own power, where our language excludes or includes, and the possibilities of the imagination to co-create a new way of being together. And so enjoy this beautiful conversation. It feels a little bit like we're at an Irish pub. And so I invite you to be at the table with this profound and generous thinker and love to know what you think of this conversation. So please share it widely if this resonates, and enjoy. Okay, well, welcome, Pádraig. Thanks so much for being on Weave with me. It's wonderful to have you.
My pleasure, Jennifer. Thanks.
Yeah. So I'd love to just to begin, if you feel called to speak to where you're feeling you're contributing most these days. Like, where are you feeling called in your poetry and your public theology thinking? Where do you feel most called to contribute?
There was a period of time a few years ago when I was saying no to lots of things because there were so many invitations coming in. And I was very grateful for them, but I didn't have the time. And I really like company. And so I realized that in the last year, my capacity for meeting people on online things, or join this symposium, or read a few poems here, or do that, it's just such a delight to go, great, I'll get to chat to people, how lovely. And so I think that the primary personal motivation for me is connection. No surprise, but it's been a lovely joy to have the opportunity for connection. And of course, there's limitations with Zoom or whatever you're meeting on, but it's better than nothing. And so I'm feeling that in particular. When it comes to public theology or poetry, I suppose I'm always interested in making connections across time. I think it seems to be a peculiar and particular arrogance of the present to imagine that there's been no time like the present. And I'm not sure I ever believed that. I think, like Battlestar Galactica, their text starts off with all of this has happened before and all of this will happen again. And I remember being so struck by the writers of that science fiction drama of brilliance about how much insight there was in that. And when people speak about unprecedented times in terms of COVID, part of me thinks, no, this has happened so often, and we don't need to go back millennia. But go back to the 80s, the AIDS pandemic, 35 million people dead, and an entire population of people who were screaming and calling out for serious public attention. And then the pandemic of Indigenous women and girls' disappearance that I know is such a concern of yours. And these other ways within which terrible things have been happening to large populations of people who have been calling for attention and have not been given resources. Contemporary circumstances are not unprecedented. Unfortunately, they're entirely precedented. And that for me is connection too. I want to make connection with time to say we must be aware that these kinds of things are always happening. and we must make ethical connections in our imagination and in our language and in our art, with the fact that actually it's not so unprecedented. It's quite precedented.
Yeah, bang on. And as you talk, it feels like, the connection that you seek and the beautiful interconnection of hearts and words and presence is what you're standing for. In this awakening around privilege. I mean, what comes up for me is just the privilege, where you hear the unprecedented times is often coming from those of us who have tremendous privilege and have been impacted by the
totally
scale of atrocities that you're speaking of. And it's absolutely all around us. And so you're making a connection of heart to say, like, awaken, not only in time do I hear you say that, but also in geographies, the geographies of the hidden, or the geographies of the shadow, where we are just not paying attention. So truth-telling. The truth-telling work, which is why I love your work so much, because it feels like you have not ever shied away. Maybe you've shied away at times, but you're really taking a stand for telling the truth, and not only in our daily lives, but you're always connecting, it seems to me, the very personal and the political at multiple scales.
I grew up with a fierce disposition to belong, and that comes with all kinds of imaginative compromises. And I was so desperate to belong. And I suppose I never doubted that I belonged to Irishness. That was fine. I speak the language and I'm from here. So lovely, No, that's a luxury as well. That in itself is a privilege. So, but I suppose when it came to Catholicism, I really did want to belong to that. I was fascinated by the text, and fascinated by ritual, and fascinated by the possibilities for community that can happen within a congregation, whatever they believed, And I was just in the place where I was born and in the religious culture that I'd grown up in. So I wanted to locate myself profoundly there, but it was killing me, the more that I was there and hearing stuff about the projections onto LGBT populations in order to justify the unbudging theological imagination about our morality and our capacity for love. The more that those things became intolerable, the more homophobia became exposed, the more that the projections onto us became bizarre and exaggerated and terrible, And so it wasn't just that you're a moral degenerate, okay? Not that that's in any way mild. It's that you're a moral degenerate possessed by the devil, or you're a moral degenerate plus. And I went on like that. And I got very sick when I was 22, and I stayed sick for the rest of my 20s. I mean, it wasn't psychosomatic, but it also wasn't a surprise that my body couldn't cope. And that on a certain sense, I got a very bad virus and it never went away. It turned into one of these 8-year post-viral syndromes. My immune system became overactive and was fighting against me. And I suppose over those 8 years of being so ill, and I always felt like I was on the first day back after a bad virus, able to work, but at the end of work, just thinking I'm fit for nothing. And then the next day would be the same. And then it would happen and I'd be out for a week and then it would come back again. And that went on for 8 years. And I suppose over that time, it gave me a lot of time by myself to write, to write poetry, to write language of survival. And I became aware that there was a part of me that knew I needed to leave this way of thinking about being gay, that I wouldn't survive. And very quickly, as soon as I began to speak about that, the very conservative circles I was in, full of lovely people, very nice people, people who would be very generous to you if you were bereaved or anything, and people who would give you their right arm. If your need was the right kind of need. My need was for an intellectual conversion. And that was not considered to be an intellectual need that was worthy of generosity. It was worthy of threat. Mm-hmm. And I lost everything very quickly, as soon as I began to come out, Mm-hmm. So, and for years on a weekly basis, I got horrible letters. And I suppose I always felt like a very reluctant person to be challenging. I never wanted that. I never had fantasies about being the person who would be, challenging the norm, or, as you were saying, generously, speaking the truth, or being unbudging about making links between the personal and the political. That has not been a fantasy of mine. My fantasy has been to be a part of the system. I mean, I don't want to be, a fat cat part of the system. I want to be a part of the system that's, hopefully good. But I didn't want to be on its edges. And it was to my shock that over the years, I found myself further and further on the edge. The more you begin to speak about the mistreatment of Indigenous people, the more you begin to speak about the mistreatment of women, the more you begin to speak about the very, very alive dynamics of colonization that are present within so many countries, not just religious systems. The more you begin to speak about how profound the hatred of the queer or the LGBT point of view is, the more you begin to realize, God, I'm being made foreign. Yeah. I don't feel like a radical, but I feel like I've been put into that situation simply by telling the truth.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Beginning of your journey around that, really wrestling with that tension where you so wanted to belong and yet feeling like this complete foreigner. And I can relate as growing up Catholic and as a strong feminist, in my own experiences with my own faith tradition. But how did you start to reconcile or reckon with that tension between belonging and then feeling completely like a foreigner in that context? And how did you start to, I know you started to work with language. There's a beautiful part in your book, In the Shelter, where you mention how what was it? The language for you started to be the reinterpretation. You started to reinterpret, and that reinterpretation, and I know you love etymology, it opened up a whole other world where it seemed to me like that was part of how you started to root yourself into something deeper, if I could call it the waves of the culture or the waves of the organizational dynamics and the power, all the superficial stuff. But there's something that rooted you deeper.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I see etymology as language as architecture, or maybe even better, language as ecosystem. Something that has grown. Architecture implies that there was one single person drawing a design. That isn't the way with language. Language evolves in a way that is very surprising and responds to crises as well as opportunities. I don't know. I suppose I felt very uneducated when it came to religion. When I was being put, as part of my job, because I was working within religion for many years, there were some exorcisms to get rid of the devils in me. And then I was living where I was working, and one of the people in charge said to me, if you want to keep living here, you'll need to go for therapy because the devils are staying in you. So you probably need psychological care for your troubles. And it was horrible. But I suppose part of that story was very redemptive in the sense of that eventually the I don't know what to call him. The man, he wasn't a therapist. He wasn't qualified, but I thought he was. He said to me, he was trying to teach me how to fantasize about the bodies of women, women who were my friends. He said to me, choose one of them in your imagination that you would like to find attractive, and let's talk about how to begin to. And I said, no, I'm not interested in having the sex that you want me to have. And then he said to me, that's because have is a selfish verb. And he said, your problem is language. Now, you couldn't say that in Irish. The verb have in Irish or in English is a very, very interesting verb. I'm having a birthday. I'm having a baby. I'm having a hard time. That's a very flexible verb. And in French and in Irish, those are two other languages that I can work around with. You can't use the verb have in the same way. And have sex, for instance. He said to me, I should say give sex, because have was selfish, but that give, he said, you should want to give sex to a woman, not have sex. And I thought, that sounds like forcing. That's worse, dear God. If there's any morality about verbs, it's the verb about give. Because does she have a choice? And ultimately, that was the masculinity that I think he was inviting me into, which is to say, no, she doesn't. In that fantasy, a woman was there to take something that was given to her, which was all about the man proving his manliness. Had nothing to do with reciprocality, nothing to do with love, consent. And I wouldn't have had the language for that, but I had the intuition for that at 20. And I think that it shocked me because he said that, and I knew that I was in danger, that if I told people what happened, that I got up and left, which is what I did, that I might have to leave where I was working and living. And I wouldn't have had somewhere to go. Going home wasn't an option. And so, but I just got up and left. And there was something about the absolute solidity of knowing there isn't a doubt in me, but that I did the right thing, and that it was through language that saved me, because I knew he was making it up. And that it was the Irish speaking part of me thought, were we talking in Irish, you couldn't have said what you just said. Like the capacity for that kind of idiotic analysis simply isn't present within the context of the structure of how you'd structure an Irish sentence. And so I think that strangely showed me that language was important. And, as I went on in years, both in terms of attention to poetry, as well as attention to theology, when I began to study that, as well as then, because theology or poetry, neither of them bring in enough to pay rent. So I needed to have work that would pay a bit of money. So I trained in conflict resolution as well. And so often with that, what you're doing is a very gentle, very democratic, very inclusive attention making to language. When somebody is saying, in the context of a dispute, what you're saying infuriates me, all of the things there can be unpicked, or if somebody says, I will never, ever change my mind about this. They're saying something very interesting about the future, and to find ways to go into the magic of language and to the magic of a sentence, to begin to say, what about that? And what about that? To exhibit curiosity, especially when language is being used with a particular level of cruelty. And I suppose what I wanted to do was to look at cruel formulations of language and to enter into those rooms, those little stanzas, with a level of curiosity, to see what's decorating the walls of those stanzas, whether that's a stanza, and stanza is the Italian word for room. So whether that's a stanza of somebody in a fight, somebody who's saying something sectarian, somebody who's saying something violent, somebody who's saying something full of pain, something I'm saying that's racist, something that I'm saying that's really limited, to find a way to step with curiosity into that uncomfortable room and to examine what's in there. I suppose I found that language saved me in that way.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. I mean, I just love what you're saying, because it takes a particular mind and curiosity and heart to be able to stay in language versus just walk away. I mean, for just in my own experience, you can experience language, particularly in the context of an institution or a particular culture, and then just say, I'm out. That's oppressive language, I'm out. And what I love about what you've done, there's a capacity in you to see the liberation and the kind of pliability of language through the etymology, through the architecture, but as you say, as a living system. And I'm just so impressed with it's not confidence. I mean, maybe that's the wrong word, but there's just a real resilience. There's a trust and a resilience that you bring to be in the mess. Like, all that feels super messy to me. I mean, conflict, and particularly in the context of all that you supported through the Corrymeela community, right? Working with the sort of post-troubles in Northern Ireland and all the aftermath. I mean, the capacity for you to really it seems like you're rooted in a sense of belonging that's like, this deep river, And then you see all the ways that we're pulled apart in your own body, in your own, in the sort of manipulation of power. And it's like, you just like smack that elastic back and you're like, we're staying here and I'm staying here. And there's this beautiful kind of, I sense from you, this like taking up space, but not in a power hungry way, with a motivation that's on behalf of all of us. It's on the behalf of this reciprocity, like what's here. So,
yeah. Well, hopefully, I suppose I think that language has the capacity to do really unexpected things, and that words can surprise us in their plurality and flexibility of meaning. And therefore, I think that's interesting. And often I think when we're speaking spontaneously in anger, we say all kinds of true things. And those might be untrue analytically, but true emotionally. And how do we pay attention to that? Which isn't to say we should all go around the place, giving vent to all of our anger all the time, because, we live in certain containments. But that, I suppose, when people say all kinds of things to each other, what you want to do is to find out what have they said and how can we find a way through that.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm really curious. I know questions, talking about language, questions and how we ask questions, and the question behind the questions are alive to you. It's another way I notice how you pay attention. And so I'm curious about what question for you right now feels the most important to reframe. What question are we asking ourselves that actually needs to be reframed in order to deepen the reciprocity for each other?
Well, I mean, very locally over on this side of the Atlantic, I suppose I'm thinking of the project of Brexit and the impact that that's having on Ireland. I live right on the border. The border's, a few feels that way. And I keep on thinking that the Brexit project was giving a bad answer to a bad question. Because the real question, I think, was, who is England? Not Britain, not Scotland, not Wales, not Shetland, not Orkney, not the Channel Islands, not the Isle of Man. Who is England? And who are Englands, plural? I think England is an extraordinary place, but one of the things that we are recognizing a century after the beginning of the collapse of empire, if empire can ever be considered to be collapsed, because it's alive and well in some ways, of course. In this era, there's this question about what to do with the glorious memory of the past that never happened, what to do with all of that. And I think that's one of the things that the Brexit project was tying into, was an imagination of the past that never happened. And that wasn't being articulated clearly. And the answer then that was being evoked, and the methodology to get an answer using a referendum in a country with no written constitution, that's not a good idea. So in a country like yours and like mine, where there is a written constitution, a referendum can be used because you pose an amendment to a written constitution, and therefore people have to vote on it and have to see it before they vote on it. Britain has no such process. They have a brilliant parliamentary process, but they don't have a written constitution. And referenda particularly are useful in places with written constitution. And so I suppose I'm living, all of us are, in Ireland. And it's important to say that there's good people who voted in a different way than I voted when it came to Brexit. I don't think that people who voted in a different way are immoral. They were but I don't think the question was clear enough. And so over and over again, when it comes to the question of the European Union, the United Kingdom, Ireland, the partition of Ireland, it's 100 years this year since the partition of Ireland. How do we find a way to ask these questions about who we are when actually something terrible has been put in motion that won't be reversible for the next 25 or 30 years, i.e. Brexit. There's more than likely going to be a vote, a border poll, as we'd call it here, a vote about a united Ireland at some point within the next 10 years. That's almost inevitable at this stage. It was already almost inevitable, but it's been sped up a few years. And so how do we ask ourselves these questions about belonging? I think that's the conundrum that we're in. And I don't know how we're going to be able to answer it.
Seems like one of those questions we're living, before, I think, instead of, and Krista Tippett says this all the time, how are we living these questions, and the question of belonging, and the question of who are we? I love that, because I feel like so much of leadership, and particularly in the political world, in short political cycles, we want to get to a quick solution. We want certainty. And yet what I hear you saying is that if we can't live these questions and live the right questions, the questions that to me are more spacious and more like scary to even sit with, because you don't know where it's going to take you, and it might take you in a completely different direction that you feel is contrary to the certainty that you want.
Yeah. I mean, I think whiteness and masculinities are in similar needs of being recalibrated into asking different questions, and recognizing that attention is not tantamount to persecution, and that accountability is also not tantamount to cruelty. But often I think I became so used to it in conflict resolution circles, where the people who had the most to lose, the people who had the least to lose were usually the ones who were the most sensitive. And the ones who had already lost a huge amount, the disenfranchised, the disempowered, they actually were used to being disenfranchised and disempowered. Not that there was any tolerance for saying that's okay, but to go, look, we're already in that kind of situation. So they were willing to take risks often to meet people, whereas I saw people from positions of great privilege and power say, well, I need to be protected when I come into that room. Like, nobody's going to attack you. You've actually been attacking other people for a long time. You're most worried that people are going to be to you who you have been to them. And you're using projection that you're going to be the new persecuted as a way to defend yourself on the possibility of what would it be like to be on the receiving end of the way that I've been treating people. And so finding a way to pay attention to those power dynamics as we are needing to examine whiteness, examine privilege, examine being cisgender, examine, masculinity, all of those global endeavors, I think, are really important, because it's easy, I think, to forget that we are really at a particular moment which has come as a result of 350, 400 years of Christianist terrorism. And to name it as such, a European expansionist Christianist understanding that thought that we had civilization to bring to a wider world, and that the wider world would eventually be better for it. And in fact, even if they're not, who cares? Because let's get rich from it. I think in 300 years, 400 years, I hope, there will be an examination of the accountabilities of now and the resistance to those accountabilities through populism, etc. So we're trying to inflate a past that was never great. And that, I think, is something to pay attention to now.
I love how you're weaving together what's alive and well here in terms of power dynamics based on different identities and whiteness. And we have the rise of Black Lives Matter and the sort of attention to race, the Me Too movement. We have, the greater recognition of transphobia and all the trans rights, particularly here in Canada. That's been coming more and more. And we just actually in Yukon, we just had the conversion therapy banned in legislation this past.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I wanted to tell you that, because that was and came from the youth. It came from high school.
Great.
Who said,
super.
We need this, and really responsive ministers. But what what I'm tracking a little bit here is this piece around the history of how we imagine ourselves, and particularly those in power, and what we so cling to that's in memory that may not be true, that may not have been in reality, and yet we're protecting it anyway. And so what are, I guess maybe a question, what are you seeing as some of the really powerful sort of leadership capacities at the local level, where these questions are, we're living these questions and we're engaging in these conversations to interrupt, but also stand in all the blame and shame and varied emotions that come with as power starts to unravel? Like, what are you seeing is skillful, heartfelt?
I mean, I think of Nicola Sturgeon, who is the First Minister of Scotland, after the Brexit vote happened, the Brexit vote shocked everybody that it went through, because it was one of the first things she did when she gave a speech, because so many Polish and Lithuanian, Scottish people were, not just Scottish in England, Wales, and in the north of Ireland too, were saying, are we going to be able to stay? Like, was this a vote against us? Etc. One of the first things Nicola Sturgeon did was to say, in Glasgow, in Aberdeen, in Edinburgh, in wherever, there are Scottish Polish people, there are Scottish Lithuanian people, and she went through a list, and she said, you belong here. And she also was saying, we don't know what's going to happen, but I'm telling you that, you belong. And so partly what I notice is the capacity to contain on a psychological level, to say, I don't know what's happening, but I'm making a really clear moral assertion here, and reading that moral assertion in light of the people who, on a tangible and evidentiary level, have the most to fear about what's happening. She's not catering to the fear of the luxuriated fears. She's catering to the fear of the realized and tangible fear. I think of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand as well, the capacity to be able to say in extraordinarily sophisticated, clear language. It's so sophisticated because it's so clear. Speaking as clearly as Jacinda Ardern doesn't come easy. You've got to work hard. And partly what I think is that she knows, who am I speaking to and who am I speaking into? What population, what capacity for citizenship am I speaking into being by this? Warmth, clarity, and certitude in terms of the uncertain things that we're speaking about. And I found her to be really inspiring, to watch her. I know lots of people were watching her going, can she just be Prime Minister of everything for a while?
The world.
Yeah. So
all come together.
Yeah. So and so I see the capacity in leadership for folks to tell the truth, to have focus, but and have a way to calling people to account in terms of the community that they're building together, and to not give too much attention to the kind of fears that will never die, but rather to contain those fears within an ethical imagination about what community belonging looks like. That always moves me, because it's not just pandering, it's not just playing it politically correct, even though I'm a big fan of the politically correct, because if it's correct, I want it, and I've benefited from,
Sure.
I'm not called a faggot on a regular basis, because people have realized, oh, you know what, that's actually cool. So I'm all for political correctness. But there is something extraordinary in terms of the ethical drive of language, and I think a secular imagination, and I don't mean secular in the sense of non-religious. Secular comes from the French word séculer, and Latin as well. Meaning, and same with siècle, the word for century in France. In French, they're related. It just means to be of your time, to be facing into the time now, to be looking outward, to be looking at the world. I mean, from a theological point of view, I think Jesus of Nazareth was an extraordinarily secular character, because he was speaking to and of his time. And I think the virtue of secular imagination is really important now, rather than ideological imagination. And what we saw in the United States over the last while and other places, they were not secular, they were ideological. And I suppose I'm looking for, and I'm impressed by people who have a secular imagination.
And where does that anchor into the truth for you? Because ideological can be, fabricated manipulation based on truth that are not real. Yeah. And so for you, does that feel like it anchors into a different kind of truth telling?
Well, I mean, the truth is a very difficult thing, of course. But what I like about an attempt to be truth telling is the attempt to say, here's what I can see. Mm-hmm. And not just what I can conveniently see, but what I am also seeing and it's uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. I suppose I see ideology, whether that's political or religious, as something to say, here's what I want to see, or even here's what I need to see, and especially here's what I refuse to see.
Exactly.
And there's something about the inconvenience of all the things we can see that's important. Yeah,
and the capacity to be with that convenience or the anguish or the terror and still, being in your body and yet able to speak with such the clarity and the sophistication that doesn't erase the mess, that doesn't fringe or push away that which is so hard to feel. And I think that's where, going back to that point where you said these are unprecedented times, tells me, well, maybe we have never opened ourselves up or had it forced upon us the experience of constraint or exclusion or, a deep loss.
Yeah. And I was talking to a friend yesterday, and she does some work in prisons. And she was saying, whatever order a vaccine is rolled out at, you can guarantee that it's a male prison that she does some work in. She said, you can guarantee that those lads know they'll be last. And I suppose I'm interested in thinking about, what about countries that have large populations of people incarcerated? What is the experience of COVID like there? And what does the experience of COVID there reveal to us about the underbelly of a society? And what is the truth that that's telling, which isn't just a truth for 2020, it's a truth about the system that's being revealed through it.
Absolutely.
And I think that's a choice to see, and a choice to see inconveniently, and a choice to say, yeah, it's getting better for lots of us, but not all. And let's continue to remind ourselves about that. Yeah. And I know some people find the language of naming your privilege a bit clunky, and I understand, it can feel awkward, but that's okay. I'm good with the awkwardness because awkward won't kill me. It'll just make me feel a bit awkward. But it is a choice, hopefully, that isn't just language, that it is reflected in action and changed policy to say what you see, and to say what for a long time populations of people chose not to see. And even if they did see it, they chose not to say it.
Yeah.
And I suppose that is the hope behind language of privilege naming and land recognition, etc., is to say we are naming stuff that lots of people chose deliberately not to name for a very long time.
Yeah.
In the hope that there's a corrective
course of action. And changed hearts when it's not, when we can, it's almost like ritual in some ways, when ritual can, at first it doesn't mean anything. And then by doing it and naming it and being in it, you're changed.
Totally. Yeah. And everything then from the increase of language acquisition to language protection to recognition of forms of sovereignties that can coexist alongside each other, to lamentation markers and all of those things. I think those are the measurements as to whether the ritual is taking effect. But There's all kinds of ways within which the ritual needs to be embraced into the body, into the psyche, in order for that to happen.
You see that a little bit here in the Yukon Territory in Canada, because we have the greatest extent of self-governing First Nations in Canada and really in North America. So it's kind of an extraordinary place to live and play in these traditional territories, Kwanlin Dun First Nation, the Ta'an. And I've watched ritual actually and spirituality become more and more infused into even public governance meetings, even national governance meetings, and whereby there is a different heart, there's a different evocation of what binds us together that has been so powerful and so invitational. And I think, going back to what you said, sometimes those who have experienced the most harm have to me, the greatest capacity for generosity and for reciprocity.
Yeah.
Not to say there's not lateral violence, and not to say that there is,
of course.
But what does it take for the rest of us, those who are in positions of power and privilege, to open up to and say yes to new ways of being together that fundamentally displace you from that familiar position of power. And so I just watching that at the local level, and each of our, I guess the invitation for those listening is like, where is that happening in your neighborhood? Or where is that happening in your community, where there's an invitation for a new way of being together that may include some rituals, that may include a lot of awkward, but is like this little portal into a new, a different kind of, not certainty, but a different kind of knowing, a clarity.
And practice. I think ultimately citizenship, we hope, I mean, of course it's a right, etc. Absolutely. But it's also somehow, hopefully, some kind of practice or even theater. I have a friend who lived in the Solomon Islands when the Solomon Islands had some, sectarian violence, and when that was being resolved, there was the surrender of armaments, and I think it's the world's only non-Eurocentric Anglican order of priests called the Melanesian Brotherhood, and it's an order of priests, Anglican and monks, where they live together in community, and people take temporary vows. Loads of people have gone there for a year and a half, and then they go on, and there's no shame in that. And it's just to say, it's quite a Buddhist understanding of a monastic vow, rather than in lots of other places there's the idea that you left the monastery, rather than you went in order to leave. That's the whole point. Anyway, those fellas are so ingrained in the community, and so many people either were in the brotherhood or knew somebody that was, that when it came time for armaments to be surrendered, and the United Nations were in there, and they were offering the possibility of going around and offering amnesty for people to surrender armaments, many communities chose to ask that the brothers would go and do that, because the brothers were doing these exchanges of armaments, or the surrendering of them, through the lens of community drama, which was deeply culturally practiced for centuries in the Solomon Islands. There was the enactment there was the enactment of funerals, there was the enactment of grief, there was people who pretended to be dead and then got up, and it was done in a form of community ritual that actually wasn't just about the cessation of violence, but it was the beginning of the capacity for a community to tell a story of grief, what they had survived and who had died as a result of that. And I think reading my friend's book who described that, it was fascinating to see how, and I have time for the United Nations, of course, great gratitude for them, but how much more beneficial the local way of knowing how to sort out this was, because it reached deeper into the past, further into the future, deeper into the heart, achieved physically the exchange or the ending of armaments, but it also achieved so much more in terms of ritual. And I think those things are local and located in a culture, in a language. And that interests me to think we don't all need to think, oh, great, what's their methodology? Let's lash that into Ireland or whatever. The point is to go, where are we? What has been practiced here for a long time? Who here remembers that? And what is the possibility of a generosity of being able to evoke that here? And if you feel like there is nothing, make one up, because those other things were made up first too. Yeah, and that demonstrates, I think, the possibility of imagination. And we do have these great theatres of citizenship. The States had a big football match the other day. That's a great theatre of citizenship. And I'm sure if I loved it, I'd love it. I mean, I don't really understand it. So, but I also don't judge it, because I know it really works for a lot of people. And it's a high holy point of a year for lots of people. Yes. As well as, though, by it not being paid attention to, it's a high danger point too, because, with some of those, without enough good attention, moments of great jubilance and celebration like that can have a very hidden, secretive side of great violence to women and girls especially. And so how can we pay attention to these rituals that are already there and give them a level of sanctity in our enacting of them, but also accountability so that their edges aren't violent?
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, and I know we have to tidy up our conversation. Unfortunately, I could talk to you all morning, but it's both aspiration and then there's this practice, this aspiration of how we can be together, how we can belong together, and where that's celebrated into, and to really let that celebration be there. And then then it's separate from, in a way, the practice. The hard practice of coming together over tea, and it's a lot awkward and it's a lot hurtful. And you write beautifully in your book about how you've been part of those conversations. So I just want to thank you for just generously being alive and giving your writing and your truth telling to us, not only in Ireland, Northern Ireland, but around the world, in places as far-flung as Yukon and Uganda.
Yeah. Well, it is genuinely a thrill to talk with you, Jennifer, and to see the Yukon light shining through your window, reflecting off the snow, and it's beautiful. Lovely. And I see your fan in the background as well, fanning the air out over your
wood stove. Yeah, it's beautiful. Creating warmth. Well, the warmth. So I just wanted to end with one beautiful thing. You say, if you could give me the Irish phrase for the way to say hug, because isn't the squeeze when it's COVID time, so we can't touch, but you can squeeze somebody with your heart.
Yeah, it's a barrel lechri, isn't that right? Just squeeze with the heart. Yeah.
So I send you a squeeze with the heart from here.
Thank you very much. I consider myself squeezed and squeezing back.
Thank you so much, Pádraig.
My pleasure. Thank you.